Hello, I am Eddie O'Sullivan, and this is This Week in the Italian Campaign.
The Allied advance towards the Barbara Line south of Rome with my guest Richard O'Sullivan, Assistant Curator for the London Irish Rifles Museum. But first, a roundup of other events in the Italian campaign 80 years ago this week. On the morning of the 16th of October 1943, German security and police forces sealed the Jewish ghetto in Rome and detained more than 1,200 people. 2 days later, more than 1,000 were transported by train to Auschwitz. Only 16 survived. On the 18th of October, the Canadian division captured Campobasso. It started to push west to link up with the Fifth Army and to the north. Campobasso soon became known as Maple Leaf City in honor of the strong Canadian presence in the town. At the start of October, Hitler approved plans for the main defensive line south of Rome. It ran 130 kilometers between the Tyrrhenian Sea south of Gaeta to the Adriatic coast and was named the Gustav Line. A key strong point was around Monte Cassino, which overlooks the valley of the River Liri. It commands the main highway to Rome, 120 kilometers to the north, and is the location of an abbey founded in the 6th century by Saint Benedict. The first Allied air raid on the town of Cassino at the foot of Monte Cassino took place on the 10th of September. There were more raids on the 4th and 10th of October. On the 14th of October, Lieutenant Colonel Julius Schlegel of the Hermann Goering Division told Abbot Gregorio Diamare that the abbey would soon be on the front line and that its art treasures had to be removed for security reasons. These included paintings, sculptures, 70,000 volumes, and an archive of 80,000 documents. On the 17th of October, trucks started evacuating the treasures. Some monks escorted the vehicles on their way to the Vatican. Some were diverted to Spoleto north of Rome, where masterpieces were taken as a gift for Hermann Goering. The operation was completed on the 3rd of November. 13 monks remained behind. The abbey was destroyed by Allied bombing in February 1944. The post-war reconstruction of the abbey was made possible primarily because Schlegel has saved its building plans. As an expression of gratitude, Abbot Diamare gave Schlegel a manuscript of thanks in Latin which read, "In the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Cassinians thank the illustrious and beloved military tribune Julius Schlegel, who saved the monks and goods of the Cassino monastery with all their hearts and ask God for his continued well-being." Transfers from Italy began in October of experienced Allied divisions nominated to play a role in Operation Overlord. They included the 1st Airborne Division, the 7th Armoured Division known as the Desert Rats, and the 50th Northumbrian and the 51st Highland Infantry Divisions. America's 82nd Airborne moved to the UK in November. Allied forces in Italy were to be bolstered by the 8th Indian and New Zealand Divisions, which had landed on the mainland earlier in the year. The Polish Second Corps, formed in the Middle East in July, was to arrive in Italy in December. On the front line, the Fifth Army advanced north of the Volturno after crossing the river on the 13th to the 15th of October. The 34th Division had to cross the river twice more as it flowed south. The 3rd Division descended from the hills and followed the valley on the west side of the Volturno. The enemy retreated slowly. Demolitions, roadblocks, mined and booby-trapped areas, self-propelled guns, and small rearguard units slowed the advance. Villages and ridges in the hills were often defended stubbornly and then evacuated at night. On the coastal plain, the advance of the 10th Corps was hindered by a network of canals running east to west across its line of advance. Heavy rain was frequent. Roads were churned up by Allied tanks and vehicles. The temperature was tumbling. By the 25th of October, the Fifth Army started to come into contact with German fortifications on the Barbara Line. On the Adriatic front, the 78th Division advanced 5 kilometers and captured the rich town of Petacciato on the 19th of October. 3 days later, a company from the Royal Irish Fusiliers advanced to capture the bridge over the River Trigno. It was blown up as they approached. They crossed the river by foot and created a bridgehead. This was to be used for an attack against the eastern section of the Barbara Line planned for the end of the month. On the left, the 8th Indian Division captured Palata in its first operation since landing in Italy earlier in the month. It then advanced to Montefalcone, 12 miles to the southwest. It took the town on the 27th of October. The 8th Army gathered itself for an attack across the Trigno. That story will be told in the next episode of This Week in the Italian Campaign. On the evening of the 26th of October, the London Irish Rifles replaced the Royal Irish Fusiliers in the Trigno bridgehead. Colour Sergeant Ted O'Sullivan brought up supplies on mules. The muleteers were immaculately accoutred Sikhs. All wore the pagri ritual turban. None had still helmets. On the way back that night, they stopped in the middle of the Trigno and washed their mules. They were immediately heavily shelled and some were killed. I waited until it was quiet and walked alone back to the mule point in pitch blackness. I crossed the Trigno ford in which they were now bodies. On the 22nd of October, Royal Irish Fusiliers Captain Laurie Franklin Vale had written to his wife Olive in the UK about one of his platoon commanders, 21-year-old Lieutenant John Glennie from Northern Ireland. I think you will be receiving a letter from John Glennie about the time you get this. We thought it would be a happy idea if I wrote to his mother, which I have duly done, and he wrote to you. He has been a grand friend, and I think you have the imagination to realize the need for friendship out here. Life would indeed be miserable without it. John and I, thrown together by circumstances, have achieved a very deep understanding. He has kept me happy and cheerful, and therefore extremely ambitious to go further. I think you would like his altruism and high spirits and liveliness, but at the same time, he has a touch of shyness and small boy aspects that make him very endearing. He is a splendid platoon commander, very forceful and resolute. I am afraid that I am very much stricter out here. One cannot afford to be weak. Orders have to be given under the most critical conditions and must receive instant obedience. Mistakes cost lives here and cannot be tolerated. I would dearly like to be with you and Valerie again, but I am philosophical about it all and keep quite happy. A regiment is an absolute byword out here. I have been amazed at the tremendous reputation here. The tank unit which cooperated with us in our last attack told us we were the finest infantry battalion they have ever met. All my love and kisses, darling girl, to you both.
Well, that takes us up to the middle of October, and each week I introduce a book that I think you might be interested in reading. There's one which is quite difficult to find, nevertheless, it's useful. It's an account of the campaign from Colour Sergeant Ted O'Sullivan, who was quoted in that package. tells the story from 39 when he was conscripted to 46 when he was demobbed. Finished up as Sergeant Major. Of course, that's my father. Another set of books that you might be interested in reading are these two that we've found. These are books about Indian Army formations. One More River is the story of the 8th Indian Division. As you heard, the 8th Indian Division are now mobilizing and are on the front line at this point 80 years ago in Italy. And that story is quite compressed, but it tells the tale. The Tiger Triumphs is a broader story of the Indian Army and another very interesting story. So I'm very pleased now to introduce my guest, who's in Windsor, Richard O'Sullivan, assistant to the curator at the London Irish Rifles Museum in Campbell. Well, Richard, how are you?
Not bad.
Okay, well, I'll take that as meaning good. So let's talk first of all about the Indian Army now, because it's an opportunity for us to do it, because they're now just making an appearance on the front line. So they landed in the 8th Indian Division, which is a division which is going to be around 10,000 men, maybe, but more or less. So that's the soldiers plus all the support, the divisional artillery and everything else that goes with it. It landed at the start of October and now is in the front line. So first of all, just what on earth are the Indian Army doing in Italy at this point in the war? What's the background to it?
Well, in some respects, it was a fairly small proportion of the Indian Army. Ultimately, in Italy, there were 3 divisions. The 4th Indian Division, the 8th Indian Division we've just introduced, and the 10th Indian Division that came in the middle of 1944. All of those 3 divisions actually were in the Middle East in 1941, 42. A couple were in Iraq, in the PI Force there. None of them were involved directly in the El Alamein battles of October 1942. But the 4th Indian Division specifically joined the 8th Army in its advance across North Africa, and actually were heavily involved in fighting in southern Tunisia in March 43. So part of the 8th Army, not coming from the First Army, but the 8th Army Montes group, Wadi Akrit and other places. So the 4th Indian Division were well-blooded in battlefield terms, but they didn't come to Italy until later in 1943. The 8th Indian Division we just mentioned, they did, as you say, arrive end of September, early October, Taranto, moved up to the front line, close to the 78th Division in the middle of October this week, 80 years ago. And the 10th, as I say, 10th Indian Division came through in 1944.
So the character of the 8th Indian Division, you look at the formations, quite a large number. The structure of the Indian Army, or what's called the Indian Army during the Second World War, is that the commanding officer of the division was a British officer, and most of them, I think, practically all the senior officers were. I think so the formation, the 8th Indian Division, it had a mixture of battalions. What were the kind of characteristics? There was always in each brigade, wasn't there? 3 brigades in the division. There was always going to be an English regiment, a regular regiment, or
yeah, there were 9 infantry battalions, as other divisions had. I mean, just to underpin your comment about the senior officers, the Major General, the officer commanding of the division, 8th Indian Division, was Major General Russell. So a familiar name to us from the Irish Brigade, but Major General Russell. But in each division, there were 9 infantry battalions and 3 brigades, and in each case there was a British Army, British battalion. So out of the 6 Indian battalions in each division, 5 of whom were stipulated from northern India or in Nepal, Gurkhas and Frontier Rifles and Punjabis. The Maratha regiment could be seen as bringing people from all over India, mostly like places like Bombay or Mysore and others. Not too many seem to have come from South India, but out of the 6 Indian battalions in the 8th Indian Division, and that was the case in the 4th Indian Division and the 10th. So 6 of the 9 infantry battalions in each of those divisions were Indian battalions. And of course, the comment you're going to say now is they weren't all from India in the current day term.
Well, we'll come to that in a second, but just looking at the formations, it's quite openly stated by the British Army in the memoirs, is that they focused on what they call the martial races in India. The British had for centuries been recruiting in India for what they consider the martial races. So the Punjabis, including Sikhs, were considered martial. The Gurkhas from Nepal were considered martial. And they would tend to recruit from the northwest. And that was explicitly stated. The view was that the Indians from southern India were not martial. And so they tended not to recruit. The other factor is a high proportion of the Indian army in India was anyway based in the north. That's correct, isn't it?
Yeah, the bases or the depots were in northern India, historically for defensive reasons, of course, for the British Empire, amongst many other reasons. And another recruiting area, which was not in the 8th Division specifically, but in some of the other divisions, were Rajputas from Rajasthan. Again, back in northern India, again, what's considered in a simplistic way as a martial group of people in Rajasthan.
That's the way the British Army viewed things at that point. They had, as the American Army did, and I'm sure all armies did, they had a racial view. They said that some people made fighters and other people didn't. The Americans were convinced that African Americans couldn't fight. So they were hardly ever deployed in the front line until much later in the Second World War. This is a very recent view. But the political background to the Indian Army at that point, quite a contentious period, because Gandhi, who was leading the independence movement or the autonomous, the self-government movement in India, he'd been arrested and detained along with other members of the Congress Party, hadn't he? So he was out of the picture. So the background was there was actually a resistance movement to any involvement of India in the Second World War. And the other nuance to it is that the Muslim League, the Congress has split the Muslim League that was looking for their own country, which became Pakistan. They were less hostile to engagement support for the British war effort. And of course, today, what then was called India, today actually comprises Pakistan, India, and Bangladesh. So when we're talking about the Indian Army, we are talking about formations that came from what are now 3 separate countries. And in fact, quite a high proportion of them, if you look at
if you add in Nepal, 4.
Well, Nepal is a separate country. I think it was semi-autonomous at that point. But the Pakistan at that point didn't exist, nor did Bangladesh. So a very high proportion of the regiments in the British Indian Army actually transferred to the Pakistan Army after independence. And quite a lot of the British Army officers went on to act as commanders in the Pakistan Army, which is not the case in the Indian Army. So that's the background. Now, the Indian Army, anyway, let's just move on to discuss the other element of what we've just seen, which is a rather detailed look at a single operation around the 22nd of October, 1943, which was the Irish Brigade coming to a river and then going across. These stories tell you quite a lot, don't they, of the reality of what the Italian campaign was like, doesn't it, Richie?
Yeah, and on a relatively narrow front, or narrow 2 fronts on each coast. So in the case we're looking at here in the Trigno, on the eastern side of the peninsula, and when you might think there's overwhelming force of the Allies, in fact there wasn't overall, but you could consider with putting your best men forward, you could advance very quickly. But of course we know well the peninsula has the mountain spine on the east side and on the west side, the rivers coming through, the Trigno River being another example. They crossed the Bifurno, they crossed the Sanakra River near Termoli. Now the next one was the Trigno. They needed to get over there. Then there was some hilltop towns beyond that. And then the next river was coming soon, the Sangro. So in each case, you could consider, the advance of one company of Royal Irish Fusiliers on the 22nd of October was a small force, and the scouting for it, the patrol had been sent out the day before by the London Irish Rifles, Desmond Woods, that had gone out on patrol, spotted it, rushed back, informed the brigadier there's a bridge that, and I think Brigadier Russell mused in his memoirs, were written soon after the events, said we've been going throughout Sicily, and the dream was to find a bridge that was unbroken. So he passed it on to the general, in this case, Everly. Everly came back, the divisional commander, and said, get it or take it with forthwith. And they rushed forward. It was inevitable. I mean, some of it was post facto memory, but of course, I would think most of them were thinking this is going to go up. And I think Brigadier Russell's comment was, it did go up like Vesuvius at the best of its form as they advanced to the side of the bridge.
So the stories, because they weren't sure how well defended, whether the river's going to be defended. In fact, the defensive line were always on the high points overlooking the river, and that was to be the pattern. They didn't defend the rivers. They just used the rivers as a barrier. And at that point, when they were going forward, they really didn't know where the Germans were. They didn't know how strong their forces were. They didn't know how many tanks there were. And even after they formed the bridgehead, they were of the opinion that San Salvo wasn't going to be very well contested. And as we're going to find out next week, it was. And then the experience of individual members of the team. And we looked at some of the accounts quite closely, like Desmond Woods, tell us a little bit about him. He was in the London Irish Rifles, because he was the one who was sent out. He was an officer to scout, and he went up to the river and he spotted the bridge. And then he had to go back, sneak his way back undercover, so he wasn't spotted, back to tell people what was going on. Tell us a bit about Desmond Woods. Gives you an insight, the kind of person.
Yeah, Desmond was commissioned pre-war as a Royal Ulster Rifleman, went to Palestine, and I think he was the youngest military cross awarded person in the British Army up to that stage. I think he was awarded a military cross in Palestine when he was 22 years
So where did
old.
he come from? Was he from north or south?
He came from, I think he came from Dublin, didn't he?
Yeah, Malahide, wasn't he?
Yeah, from a certain tradition in Malahide, but he was born in the Free State. Probably wasn't created Free State when he's born, sorry.
Well, he was born in Ireland when it was part of the United Kingdom.
Indeed, that's right. So he was born during the First World War, or just before the First World War. I'm trying to work out the dates now, but during the First World War. So back to the point, which is he then came back to Britain. He missed going out with the Royal Ulster Rifles, probably luckily for him, to Dunkirk, missed that element of the Royal Ulster Rifles campaign. Then for a short period became an ADC to General Montgomery in the United Kingdom. Some really good account of him shadowing Montgomery around southern England, as you can imagine. It was an interesting sort of type of service he was providing to General Montgomery at the time, during 1941. And then he didn't go out initially with the London Irish Rifles. He was still a Royal Ulster Rifleman. That was the sort of the parent of London Irish Rifles, you could say. And then ultimately he was sent out to Sicily in actually just about the same draft as Laurie Franklin Vale, caught up with the battalion in Italy, and then was posted to the London Irish Rifles, initially as second in command in H Company, but at Termoli, just after Termoli, the commanding officer of H Company, Major Bill Westcott, was severely wounded, and Desmond Woods picked up the reins of H Company in early October 1943. So actually, he shouldn't really have gone out on a patrol. A captain, officer commanding of a company, an infantry company, shouldn't have really gone out on patrol. He was sent by Russell, thinking that he's quite an experienced officer.
That shows you at this point, because they've already had casualties. They've had people who have been injured, killed, wounded. They got ill. They're malaria and the sickness. So there's a constant churn. There's also limited reinforcements at this stage, so they're having to make do with what they've got. So people get very quick promotion. Not always happy to have it. You mentioned Montgomery, of course, commander of the 8th Army at this point, but you can see that the Allies are preparing for overlord at this point. 7 divisions taken out of Italy. And it's quite telling that the divisions that were taken out in October, November, December for Europe included divisions that Montgomery really liked. So the Desert Rats, 7th Armoured, the Highland Light Infantry, the Highland Division, and the Northumbrian Division. Do you think at this point that Montgomery was actually I mean, how he must have been pretty certain he's going to be commanding he's going to be involved in Operation Overlord, didn't he?
I don't know what the specific dates were, and you may know better than I what was going on behind the scenes in terms of appointing the commander of land operations at Normandy. I think there was a discussion, wasn't there? They thought Brooke might take it on. But going back to the specifics about Italy, October at this stage, ultimately he did leave Italy at the end of December 1943. His memoir takes you up to the Moro River at the end of December, and he left during the intense fighting north of the Moro River at Turner in December. He was seen as he would be quite often going to the front line during this period, or near to the front line, visiting the troops, giving cigarettes out to the men. Famous stories of handing out cigarettes. Montgomery, being a famous non-smoker, was handing out 3,000 Gallagher's to actually our father, Ted O'Sullivan, the book you just referred to. That says the last time I met Monty was when he gave me 3,000 Gallagher cigarettes, November 1943. So you could say this element of his generalship, perhaps he knew it was the last stage of it. And
well,
I don't know.
Feeling, because some people do say that one of the reasons why the campaign, particularly when he got to Ortona, and we'll be discussing that much later, which is a very serious experience for the Canadian Division, that to an extent his mind was on other matters. He was already new. And it is quite telling that the divisions taken out are the divisions that Montgomery was familiar with.
Of course, yeah, the two infantry ones and the armored division, to come across from Egypt into Libya, into Tunisia, had gone into Sicily, the first 8th Army, combined 8th Army operation with 5th Army, and started the 51st. Went into the toe, did they? I can't remember exactly, but they were still around in September 1943, but then swiftly taken out of the line and sent back. So,
which does raise the question about we mentioned the Indian Division, but also we mentioned the New Zealanders and the Poles, and by the end of the year, all of them are going to be deployed. This was a way of dealing with the fact that 7 divisions were being moved out, so they got some new blood, and they brought in divisions New Zealand, the Polish division, Polish Corps, which had been assembled, and the Indian Division and divisions. So that's one of the reasons why the Italian campaign became, from the Allied point of view, one of the most multinational operation in Europe in the war.
The 78th Division on the Adriatic coast was the only British division for that latter part of 43, and in fact they were taken out early in December and sent back. And on that point, the 78th Division, books I'm reading at the moment, cover that period. Cyril Ray's Algiers to Austria, that was written very soon after the war, the 78th Division. Ken Ford's updated version of the 78th Division history was written in about 20 years ago. But you're right, the multinationalness was being emphasized more and more in this period. On the west side, there was a different matter. It became more diverse by the day over on the west side under 5th Army, of course.
And of course, we're going to hear more about the French joining the campaign as well. And that added a completely new dimension. Look, Richard, it's great talking. Thank you for being here. You're going to be a guest again in due course. For the moment, thanks very much.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Well, that's it for this edition of This Week in the Italian Campaign. We will be back again next week with another look at what was happening 80 years ago in Italy during the Second World War. So until then, goodbye, good luck, and may God bless you all.